Microsoft Information Protection Profile is a key thing here. And it's probably quite hard for the end user to handle it. And so we have here next up Hannes Haug from Isolutions, and Isolutions is a Microsoft partner, and they're our first partner in the Securosys 365 program. And let me introduce Hannes quickly. Hannes started out in the financial services industry, and he's now a senior systems architect at Isolutions, where he's working on security and compliance consulting with a strong focus on Microsoft 365 technologies. So Hannes, how is MIP really used?
So good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm Hannes, and with me in the webinar is Mike, head of Isolutions business development and partner. First, well, I can almost skip over this slide since Daniel did such a great introduction into information protection, but I want to nevertheless highlight some points here. First, information protection, we see this as a part of information governance, and it's not technology, it's a process or a set of processes, and they are about compliance with legal, regulatory, but also business requirements like business risk management or simply contractual obligations. And like Daniel explained, it's know your data, discovering it, labeling it, encrypting it, like applying usage restrictions, cannot be printed, stuff like this. Also data loss prevention, Daniel mentioned briefly, and well, govern your data like retention and disposition. That's not really our today's topic, but it's a process supported by technology. And our approach to help customers adopt information protection is basically we follow this processes outlined by Microsoft. First, there's know your data. We start with the definition of the scope, including the identification of storage locations to apply information protection. Yeah, is it for SharePoint documents? Is it for documents in file shares? Is it for emails and so on? Based on this, we develop classification labels and criteria for these labels, like content or organizational source of the data. This requires close collaboration with the specific business units or functions. Then we scan, as Daniel outlined, the storage locations. And we can have fixed rules like the content contains the pattern of a social security number, or contains the string form ABC or template XYZ. Or we can train an AI by providing a set of typical documents. Next step is the protection of data. We start with the analysis of specific use cases and related risks. Then we define and implement protection measures. Here we need a full understanding of the compliance requirements, as well as the implications of their organizational and technical implementations. Daniel mentioned some possible implications briefly. And we classify documents manually or again by scanning storage locations. Then we come to prevention of data loss. In DLP, we again start with the analysis of specific use cases and related risks. Then we define and implement protection measures. Again, we need a full understanding of the requirements as well as the implications. And we do this mostly in cycles. The scope of information protection can be extended in several iterations across multiple dimensions, like organization, storage location, or classification. This whole process is accompanied by project management in order to plan, organize, and control activities so that that project is completed as successfully as possible. And last but not least, since, well, this is not only about technology, but about the organization, in the end, about people too, we help them adopt new processes and behaviors by tried and tested, but also tailored adoption and change management measures, like governance, communication, trainings, pilots. And I want to go now to a specific example. But first, let me explain that we see demand for information protection from different domains. First, there is this generic data protection, protection of personal information according to data protection laws. Then we have the classic regulated industries like financial services or health. But intellectual property or trade secrets and contractual obligations are important in many other industries too. And then, of course, there's the area of national security, including defense industry, where the requirements are considerably higher. And each of these domains has its own challenges, like in the data protection case, we have data subject requests. We don't have them in the other cases. And in the intellectual property case, there are laws on the protection of trade secrets in many countries. For instance, we have an EU directive from 2016, which has been implemented in national law across the EU. But it's often effective along the value chain. And similarly, industry regulation is often enforced along the value chain too. And we now have such an example. It's the car engineering group, sorry, I cannot give the name, which provides engineering services to, among others, the German car industry. And its crown jewels are its own or its customers' intellectual property related to new products. And the challenge of the customer is, or was, to protect this intellectual property according to industry regulation and the certification according to this regulation. And the German car industry developed the TISAX control set based on ISO 27001, but extended it, for instance, in the area of prototypes. And the industry has required many business partners to have TISAX certification. So many companies are subject to some sort of industry regulation because of, in the end, contractual obligations. The car industry is just an example. And information protection is important in all industries with substantial R&D, with industrial espionage. For instance, my brother was a controller in the R&D department of a German car manufacturer, and he was not allowed to carry a mobile phone with a camera. And even in the financial services, we usually don't have such rules. Of course, there's the rule of no phones on the trade floor, but that's an edge case. Back to the car engineering group, the company simply wants to provide its services in a certain industry and has to follow the rules. In other cases, it might be simply a business decision to have state-of-the-art protection of crown jewels. So how did we support this customer? We implemented information protection by following and tailoring our framework. First, we reviewed and, if necessary, established governance structures. We identified or defined governance bodies, processes, corporate policies. Then we defined general sensitivity labels, ranging from C1 for public over C2 internal, C3 confidential, to C4 strictly confidential or secrets. Usage rights, like cannot be printed. Encryption, which was only applied to a higher classification level. We also saw this in the other presentation. And of course, access rights. These general definitions were elaborated in several iterations. First for the audit relevant data, then for further intellectual property, then for legal, financial, and in the end, HR data. We did this because, for instance, the specific controls for HR confidential might be very different from TSAX confidential, and the access rights as well, of course. This is an example of where we initially started in the domain of intellectual property with its specific aspects. That's the audit relevant data, further intellectual property, and in the end, covered also the domain of personal information. That's the HR case, personal information with its own challenges like data subject requests. And in each iteration, we defined with the sub-labels. We defined them mostly per business unit or function. These sub-labels are usually only visible and applicable to these units or functions. The rest of the organization doesn't have to see them. Employees only see the labels that are really relevant to them. Then we identified and mapped the specific compliance requirements for these sub-labels, implemented the respective controls, the usage rights, encryption, and access rights per sub-label, and depending on the iteration, scanned and classified existing documents. But often information protection is implemented in a forward-looking way and only applied to new documents. Finally, we empowered users. Actually, this accompanied the whole project and was not really a step at the very end. Again, this can depend on the business unit or function. Information protection doesn't have to be intrusive and for the whole organization or something like this. You really can focus the hard work on specific cases, on specific information. So what was the customer success? First, the successful audit, and this goes to the core of the business, being able to provide certain services in a certain industry. Furthermore, the car engineering group has now an overview over its confidential information. And finally, it has improved secure external collaboration with customers as well as partners. If we now look at the level of protection we have achieved, just several areas. We have high protection level against unauthorized persons or information in unprotected storage locations, because documents stay protected and identities and access rights are checked on document access and not on access of documents stored in specific location, like in the SharePoint library also. It's for documents and the files too. We have limited protection against misconduct of authorized persons, like accidental sending or storing of confidential information, or against leaving paper documents in public transport and hotels, because this requires the correct classification and there's always human error. We have technical and organizational ways to support users, but in the end, there are some limitation. And there are areas where we have low protection level. That's the criminal behavior of authorized persons. In the end, we can always make photos and then circumvent information protection. Like you can now make a photo of this presentation and I have no control over it. And we have low protection if user accounts and endpoint devices are compromised. On the left-hand side, we see access is always checked. But if the user account and endpoint devices are compromised, well, we have an issue. And therefore, we draw some conclusions. To have real information protection, we can't simply focus on information protection in a narrow sense. We need user accounts and endpoints protected properly. The rights should be assigned restrictively. Users should be supported. And mechanisms should be used in a focused and risk-based manner. We saw the overview on how many % are strictly confidential, how many can be protected by bring your own key, and so on. We really have to focus on make risk-based decisions, implement the right controls for the right risks. Our learnings from this and other information protection projects are: information protection can be an enabler, but requires acceptance and use by people. And close collaboration between business and IT is essential, and employees should be supported in the adoption of information protection. It's not like deploying a new virus scanner or so, or just switching a feature on. It has impact in how we work, with information, how we perceive information, that we are aware of the classification of documents, of information. Then we choose a focused and iterative rollout to optimize early value. And we also heard this, we need to be aware of the impact of information protection. Microsoft 365 provides a rich set of productivity and collaboration capabilities, plus related security and compliance ones by processing data. If we limit the processing of data, we might not only limit the productivity and collaboration capabilities, like limitations in external collaboration, but also the security and compliance ones. If we limit, for instance, if we limit features in the cloud because there's no malware check in the cloud, it might be a good idea, like ramping up endpoint security. That's a good idea anyhow. And this all plays well with a zero trust or defense in depth strategy, where we don't fully trust single aspects or single containers, perimeters, but always have additional lines of defense. In this case, can be ramp up endpoint security. Now, let's look at our benefits. What can be achieved with information protection? What's the business benefit? We have a company-wide overview of confidential information and manage the related risks. And this is regardless of source location. And that's quite new for many customers. It's not about storage locations like SharePoint, file shares, etc. This would be too limited for modern work anyhow. We want to exchange information and collaborate on information in flexible ways with external collaboration. And it's really about protecting information wherever it resides. It's about external collaboration. It's about documents in the wild too. We remain in control. We can revoke access rights. We can monitor the access of documents, even if they are not stored in storage locations that we have under control. And this leads to the legal, regulatory, and business requirements. We meet them, and it's often not easy, but we can meet legal, regulatory, and business requirements, which can be an enabler for cloud adoption. many industries struggle with cloud adoption. They have these essential parts of their information, of documents, where it's not easy to move stuff to the cloud, and information protection can help you, as well as for secure internal and external collaboration. And this all contributes to our modern work and security strategy. Yeah, with this protection of information, regardless where it is stored, we can support new ways of working together, internally, externally. And this is important from a security point of view, of course. I guess I'll skip over the company slides briefly. And wrapping up, thank you for attention. I hope I was able to give you some insights in a real world example from Isolutions, the one-stop shop for Microsoft technologies, but also culture transformation and change management. Thank you.